All was quiet on the mighty river, but soon a steamboat appeared, breaking the silence with its chugging. Wait a minute, that's not a steamboat, it's a house. In fact, it's the Mark Twain House in Hartford, Connecticut. Mark Twain, whose real name was Samuel Clemens, lived in the house with his family from 1874 to 1891. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. During the years I worked as a guide at the Mark Twain House and Museum, a frequent question from visitors was, what is the architectural style of this Connecticut landmark? Did Mark Twain really want it to look like a steamboat? I don't know if there's any evidence for that, but there is a type of house described as Steamboat Gothic, found in the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. They do indeed have decks resembling those of a steamboat. The term was popularized by the 1952 novel of the same name by Francis Parkinson Keyes. Like the Mississippi and the Ohio, the Connecticut River also had plenty of steamboats that for years made their way to Hartford, arriving at the foot of State Street. And I'd say that the deck along the east side of the Twain House, which then extends southward into what's called the Umbra, does give the feel of a ship's deck. Certainly, Mark Twain is a quintessentially American author, strongly associated with the Mississippi River. But he was also a great world traveler, and there was a significant European influence on the style of his house. Mark Twain lived in a neighborhood of Hartford called Nook Farm that had many houses whose architecture reflects the picturesque Gothic and Italianate styles. These were popularized in the United States by the writings of the landscape architect Andrew Jackson Downing. One answer to the question of what is the architectural style of the Mark Twain House is to call it picturesque, which is a pretty broad term. You could also call it picturesque Gothic, as were so many of the homes of Mark Twain's Hartford neighbors. A difficulty here, though, is that the Twain House doesn't have a lot of classic Gothic revival features. Let's compare it to the home of one of his neighbors, Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her now lost original home in Hartford was a Gothic revival-style mansion called Oakholm, which was designed by the architect Octavius Jordan. Oakholm and the Mark Twain House have a similar gabled look, but Oakholm has many Gothic details that the Twain House doesn't have, like pointed Gothic windows, a distinctive type of decoratively incised barge boards, and drip molds around the windows. Now, the Twain House certainly has a lot of decoratively carved woodwork, found in its many gables as well as along its ground floor and third-story decks. But this decoration is in a quite different style. In fact, one way to describe the style of the Mark Twain House is to say it was built in the stick style. Wait a minute. This house isn't built out of sticks. Stick style is a later term coined by architectural historian Vincent Scully to refer to a type of house that was popular in the 1870s and 1880s. A good example of a stick-style house is the Benedict Miller House in Waterbury, Connecticut. The stick style is called that because the walls are decorated with stickwork, patterns of raised boards which mimic the look of half-timbering or the exposed beams of Tudor houses. The stick style is often viewed as transitional to the later Queen Anne style, and like Queen Anne, it often overlapped with the Eastlake style, which featured intricately carved exterior millwork. The Benedict Miller House features this as well, with its elaborate wooden porch balustrades and decorative roof brackets. In addition to the woodworking, the house also has horizontal decorative bands in its ground floor brickwork. This feature in particular is reminiscent of the Mark Twain House. Getting back to Hartford, as I mentioned, the Twain House has plenty of exterior woodwork along the porches and in the gable trusses, and it also has stickwork boards applied along flat surfaces. But much of the focus of the decoration is in the brickwork, which has additional painted decoration, and in the polychromatic patterns on the roof tiles and chimneys. The prominence of these aspects make the house less an example of the stick style than of what's called the High Victorian Gothic style. This brings us back to the term Gothic, but High Victorian is a later form of Gothic than the Carpenter Gothic revival represented by Oakholm, which I talked about earlier. It is also distinct from the stick style. These are more Connecticut examples of stick-style houses. While the stick style decorates its patterned surfaces with wood, the High Victorian Gothic style does the same thing in masonry and brick. You might consider the stick style to be a distinctively American derivation of the High Victorian Gothic, the latter style having originated in England. The style was championed there by the writer John Ruskin, and it was often used by architects designing public, collegiate, and ecclesiastical buildings. When the style came to the United States, it was used for similar types of buildings. For instance, South Congregational Church in Springfield, Massachusetts, which was designed by architect William Appleton Potter. His older half-brother, Edward Tuckerman Potter, designed a number of high Victorian Gothic-style buildings, like the Knott Memorial at Union College. He also designed many Episcopal churches, including several in the Hartford area: St. John's Episcopal Church in East Hartford, Trinity Episcopal Church in Wethersfield, and the Church of the Good Shepherd in Hartford. Oh, and by the way, Edward Tuckerman Potter was also the architect of the Mark Twain House. The High Victorian Gothic style was used less often for houses, but there were two other contemporaneous examples in Mark Twain's neighborhood of Nook Farm in Hartford. One was the Charles Boardman Smith House, which still stands on Forest Street. It was designed by Richard M. Upjohn, who was also the architect of the Connecticut State Capitol building. Earlier in his career, Potter had studied under Upjohn's father, the elder Richard Upjohn, who had emigrated from England and is considered by some to have been America's greatest ecclesiastical architect. Besides the Upjohn-designed Smith House, Potter himself was the architect of another Nook Farm home in the High Victorian Gothic style, erected in 1873 for George and Lily Warner, and later occupied by George's brother, the author and newspaper editor Charles Dudley Warner, who co-wrote the novel The Gilded Age with Mark Twain. Sadly, the Warner House no longer exists, but it was very similar to the Twain House in many ways, including the horizontal patterning in its brickwork. We can be thankful that George and Lily Warner recommended their architect Potter to Sam and Livy Clemens. Sadly, the Warner House is long gone, but the Clemens House survives. So is High Victorian Gothic, then, the best architectural description of the Mark Twain House? It's the one I've typically used, but it's hard to capture the distinctiveness of this unique structure with any one label. Did Mark Twain's biographer, Justin Kaplan, describe it best when he wrote of it in his 1966 book, Mr. Clemens and Mark Twain, as, quote, part steamboat, part medieval fortress, and part cuckoo clock, unquote? Or perhaps we should turn to Twain himself. An 1877 poem attributed to Mark Twain begins, quote, "These are the bricks of various hue, and shape and position straight and askew, with nooks and angles and gables too, which make up the house presented to view, the curious house that Mark built," unquote. If you enjoyed this video, you might also like my videos about Mark Twain's neighborhood, Nook Farm, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's lost mansion, Oakholm. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.